Good morning and welcome to Cool Springs. Today is Friday, December the 6th, 2024, and this is our series, Heroes and Heroines of the Bible. And our heroine today is somebody that you wouldn't expect to be called a heroine because mostly she gets a bad rap, Bathsheba. Generally, whenever Bathsheba is talked about, it's in terms of the adultery. We did a because David's palace is on a high ground on the city. Some Bible scholars will try to say that she shouldn't have been out there, baby, to avoid tempting David. But you see, David isn't supposed to be there. His nation is at war with the Ammonites. David is supposed to be across the Jordan River with his troops, where Bathsheba's husband is serving in the military. But David's back at home taking it easy while other men fight the battle for him. And David sees her, and he immediately starts to have lust because men tend to be very visual. And he asked his servants, "Who is that woman?" Forcing the servants to go out and look at her. Bathsheba is, but he knows who Uriah is, because Uriah is a Medal of Honor winning type of soldier in David's army. He's one of the top 30 soldiers in the whole country. So the fact that she was married, it didn't matter that she was married to one of his most highly decorated soldiers. She could have been married to some shepherd or farmer. The fact that she's a married woman should have told David, hands off. But he didn't listen to the fact that she's married and that she's married to somebody who is loyally serving him out on the battlefield at this very moment. He sends for her because, you see, as the king, he holds all the power. And he has relations with her, and then she has to go back home after he's through with her. And he doesn't send for her again until she sends word to him that she's pregnant, and he still doesn't call for her. He sends for Uriah, and he tries to pass off the child as Uriah's. He's hoping Uriah will come home on this break from the war to get as Uriah's own. But we know what happens in that story. Uriah doesn't do it. David tries again. He tries to get him drunk. Uriah still doesn't go home. So David sends Uriah back to the battlefield with sealed orders, and Uriah doesn't know that he's racing back to the battlefield with the king's order to have him put to death to make it look like just an incident of war. As soon as David hears that Uriah is dead, now he sends for Bathsheba again, and he hurriedly makes her his wife. But in all that, Bathsheba is not a person who has influence or power over what David the king is going to do, over what Uriah, her husband, might do when he hears that she's pregnant, if he lives to hear that. No, she's the victim in this. It's the fact that we try to impose our 20th and 21st century ideas of morality and what men and women can do and are capable of, and we try to superimpose it 1000 BC to where we mistakenly assume that Bathsheba is a willing participant in an act of sexual immorality, rather than seeing her as, wait a minute, she might be the victim of David's sexual predatory ability. He's a man. He has more physical strength. He's the king. His servants won't intervene on her behalf, even if she screams out and cries for help, because they serve the king. David is in the position of power, and it is entirely probable that he abused his power to take advantage of this woman. And you see, bad things happen to people sometimes, and they'll allow the bad thing that happens to them to color the rest of their lives in the wrong way. Some people remain forever a victim. One of the reasons I've chosen Bathsheba to be a heroine of the story is that we hear about Bathsheba mainly in the context of David's taking her and the resulting pregnancy, and David's murder of Uriah, and David being called by the prophet Nathan to account for his sins. And you see, that's another argument in favor of Bathsheba being simply the victim of David's lust. Nowhere does Nathan or anyone else in Scripture at the time point the finger at Bathsheba. Nathan points the finger of blame solely at David and says, "You are the man. You have done this thing." And David admits that he has sinned against God. He doesn't say, "Bathsheba and we sinned against God." David realizes he was responsible. But rather than letting that one horrible incident that happened to her and the other horrible incident where David murders Uriah to cover up his sexual sin, Bathsheba doesn't let that wreck the rest of her life. You can overcome bad things that happen to you when you put them in the context of trusting in God and not taking blame that doesn't belong to you. God can make something beautiful out of your life, no matter what has happened to you. So now we're going to go to the board, and we're going to look a little bit more at Bathsheba. The name Bathsheba, the back part means daughter. Her name means daughter of an oath. She is the wife of Uriah. Her father was a counselor to King David, as was her grandfather. In fact, we're going to find out later on in the accounts of the Old Testament that when Absalom rebels against his father David many, many decades later, Bathsheba's grandfather, who had been serving David for many, many years, changes his loyalty, and Bathsheba's grandfather will side with Absalom. Wonder if maybe his decision to turn traitor against David had something to do with what he knew had happened to his granddaughter in David's hands. But it means daughter of an oath, specifically a divine oath. After the incident of the conception of that first child, the child that is going to die a week later after its birth, Bathsheba is apparently going to have a good relationship with David. She is going to arise in power and influence. She is going to become the mother of Solomon and of at least 3 or 4 other children by David. Woman. Well, if Solomon is the Lemuel who writes Proverbs 31, then the description of the model of what a biblical woman should be would be from his mother Bathsheba. We know she arises in power and influence. She and David will have a good relationship when David is old and he's still on the throne, but he's not physically capable of leaving his bed anymore. One of his sons, Adonijah, is going to try to seize control of the throne while David's still alive and laying there in the palace in his bed. Bathsheba will go and talk to David and remind David of a promise he had made years earlier that her son Solomon, who is younger than Adonijah, will be the one who will follow him on the throne. Bathsheba will work with Nathan the prophet, who is still there serving David, to influence David. Nathan backs up what Bathsheba is saying, and David will indeed see to it that Solomon is put on the throne right then and there, and that he and Solomon will co-reign for the rest of David's life. So she arises in power and influence. The bad thing that happens to her earlier in her life doesn't doom the rest of her story, and some of you might need to hear that whatever bad thing has happened to you or to somebody you love doesn't have to destroy your relationship with God, and it doesn't have to destroy your ability to live an abundant life. She overcomes, she arises in power and influence. It's not how you start, it's not what happens to you. It's how you respond. The command to us is to finish well. When Paul is writing in the New Testament, and he's writing to Timothy, and Paul knows his time on earth is getting short, Paul gives some instructions to Timothy. He encourages Timothy to come and see him. And Paul also looks back on his life from his prison cell, and Paul realizes that, yes, I'm finishing well, that I've run my race, that I've done what God told me to do. And through all the ups and downs and hardships of life, I know that my time on earth is getting short, but there is a reward stored up for me in heaven. We need to finish well. This piece of advice goes to both men and women. Marry someone who has an authentic relationship with God. There can't be more solid advice to young people who are considering who they should date and who they will ultimately marry than to seek out someone who has an authentic relationship with God. Bathsheba's first husband is not an Israelite by birth, but clearly he has joined himself to the people of God. He is serving willingly as a member of David's army. He is a very brave and valiant soldier, taking care of the needs of the nation. And he dies at the hand of the king, who was disloyal to him, though Uriah was loyal to David. We don't know anything much about Bathsheba's relationship with Uriah, except that one little clue when in 2 Samuel, starting in chapter 11 and going forward, where they're talking about what happened with David's taking of Bathsheba and his having Uriah deliberately killed on the battlefield. She gets word that her husband has died, and she mourns for him. If they hadn't had a good relationship, she might have been just relieved that he is no longer alive, because if he were alive and he hears of her pregnancy, Uriah had the power of death over Bathsheba. But it says that she mourned for him. So clearly she had at least proper feelings for the person that she was married to. She cared about her husband. To be sad over his death, she mourns for him. She immediately becomes David's wife, and David has married many other people. They had the power as kings to take multiple wives, and plural marriage was at least tolerated. It's never anything that God actually affirms. It's something that is at best tolerated in the Old Testament, because women can't go out and support themselves except by acts of prostitution. In this day and time, they had to have a male protector. But many of the women that the scriptures describe David as having married, we hear about their names, and maybe we hear about who they mothered, but other than that, they're just part of the harem. Clearly, Bathsheba, when she married David, grew in her relationship with David to the point that David listens to her about what should be done as far as who is going to be the next king. So she is married now to David. Not too much choice there. She's pregnant with his baby. But she's married someone who has an authentic relationship with God. We're all human beings. Even the most godly husband or godly wife will have shortcomings, because we are sinners saved by grace. She doesn't marry a perfect man, because there isn't one out there other than Jesus. He doesn't marry a perfect woman. But you marry someone who has an authentic relationship with God. How do we know that David's faith in God was real when, after all, he has committed adultery and murder, and all the blame for that is laid on him? David repents when he is confronted with his sin. So the best thing we can do is marry someone who has an authentic relationship with God, and recognize that God shows up for us even in our tragedies. Being taken by David was a tragic event in Bathsheba's life. being sent back home after he had used her body for his lustful desires and pleasure, was an unpleasant experience for her. Discovering that she's pregnant with this other man's child and realizing the seriousness of that was a tragic experience for her. Hearing that David's solution to the problem was to have her husband killed was a tragic circumstance for her. But tragedy doesn't have to define your life. You can overcome tragedy, and you can realize that God shows up for us even in our tragedies. She wound up being married to David, who was somebody who had his faults, big faults, but who had an authentic relationship with God. They grew in their relationship with each other, and they grew in their trust in God, so that when the time came where Adonijah is trying to steal the throne right out from under his aged father's nose, Bathsheba works with the prophet Nathan to see that justice is done for herself, for her son, and for the nation. God shows up for us even in our tragedies. We don't like having to go through bad, rough experiences. We certainly don't like losing the people that we love. But God sees us through it all. And so we need to learn to trust God even in our tragedies, to let him work his will in our lives so that we finish well. David dies. Solomon ascends to the throne. Bathsheba is still alive, and she's there to be able to provide motherly, godly wisdom to her son as he leads the nation. So that makes her a heroine after all. Thanks for watching.